In this lecture, we're going to review the use of psychological assessment and measurement in sports psychology. We'll review some of the different ways that it's used, some of the general issues with the use of assessment, and perhaps even some of the ways that assessment may be misused. There's all kinds of ways that we use psychological assessment and measurement within sports psychology and in sports psychology research. There's a whole wide variety of diverse methods of measurement. These include things like self-report. That may be the first thing that comes to mind with you when you think of assessment as a self-report questionnaire of some kind. We could measure things like psychological or mental skills, personality, mood. We may look at daily diary methods to help track how things change over time. So there's lots of different ways that we can use what we call a self-report. We used to call these paper and pencil, but of course today these can also be done on computers, tablets, smartphones, lots of other ways. Interviews are a big part of assessment in sports psychology. These can be both structured, meaning a set specific questions that are done in a certain order, versus unstructured, which are really just guided by an expert following up on information that's of most interest. Direct observations are often used in both sports psychology consulting and in research. Sometimes for different applications, there are specific coding systems developed. One example of this is for coaching behavior. There's a well-known CBAS, a CBAS, which is a coaching behavior coding scheme in which a trained observer would go to a practice or a competition and observe directly and track certain behaviors of the coach. How often do they praise, criticize, instruct, those sorts of things. And lastly, collateral reports are somehow used. This is basically asking other people to give their impressions, observations, judgments about the behavior of another individual. So these are all things that are common in psychology at large, and they're certainly all applied in sports psychology as well. Two really important issues we like to think about when we think about any kind of psychological measure are the characteristics of reliability and validity. You've probably come across these in other classes, maybe haven't always completely understood it. I'm going to do my best to explain it here. So reliability and validity are really key hallmark characteristics of any good assessment measure. They should be both reliable and valid. And these mean different things. Reliability in general means consistency. It can mean getting the same result upon repeated measurements. So you use the measure several times. Do you get the same result? That's what we sometimes call retest reliability. Another kind of reliability is, do different users of the measure get the same result if they use it on the same individual? So two people administering the measure come up with the same conclusions. That's what we mean by reliability: consistency across time, across administrations, that sort of thing. Validity is a bit of a different concept and has a pretty broad definition that can include lots of things. It's about truth, accuracy, and meaningfulness. So different sort of things about, does this measure really mean anything? So for validity, we ask questions like, does this measure actually measure what it claims to measure? If you have a measure of anxiety, is it measuring anxiety? Does it score high for people who have lots of anxiety and low for people who have low anxiety, for example? Is the measure accurate? Does it seem to give an accurate measure, both within the person over time and across people, of differences? When there are differences that actually occur, does this measure detect those differences, is another way to think of it. And lastly, does it measure or mean anything that's important, or does it predict anything that happens in the real world? So that'd be another indicator of validity. I have a ruler on this slide because a ruler is a really good example of both a reliable and valid measure. With some really simple training, people can be trained to use the ruler really reliably. I think they train kids in first grade how to use a ruler. And once you know how to use a ruler, you and another person can get the same measure very precisely, applying that same measure. So it's definitely reliable. We get the same thing every time. And we know that it measures length of something, and length is a thing, and it's a thing we care about. It tends to measure it pretty accurately. And it's important because, for example, if you're a carpenter and you need to measure something 24 inches long to fit in a space, and your measure produces something 26 inches long, it's not going to fit. So we know that it does produce meaningful information that is important in the real world, another aspect of validity. So with psychological measures, we're looking for both reliable and valid measures. Are they consistent, and do they tell us something that's true and meaningful? I like to use this target metaphor to think about reliability and validity as well. So in this target, we think about sort of the dots on the target here are the results of our measurement, and we're going to try to determine based on where those land on the target whether our measure is reliable or valid. In this first example, we have a small collection of dots, but they're not anywhere near the bullseye, and so we'd consider this one reliable. It's consistent. It's getting the same thing every time, but not really valid. It's not hitting the mark or getting accurately what we want. This example is one that has more scatter to the dots, so it's less reliable. We might say it's not reliable, but on average, it's valid because on average, these are clustering around the bullseye, but that's not going to be ideal either. This next target is probably the worst possible option. This is neither reliable nor valid as a metaphor. The shots don't cluster anywhere together. They're nowhere even on average near the bullseye. This would be a least useful measure. But what we're looking for ideally with measures is ones that are both consistent, what we call reliable. So this one has a very narrow pattern or scatter to the shots, and it's valid. It's hitting right on the bullseye. Every shot is hitting exactly where we want to hit. And so this is a metaphor for both reliable and valid is a small scatter that is right on the target. I hope that metaphor is helpful. I always think about that when I'm trying to think about the difference between reliable and valid and what that might mean. So there's lots of different ways we might use psychological assessment in sports psychology. This slide is meant to summarize some of the major ones. Certainly, probably first and foremost, we want to try to understand individual performers or try to enhance their self-understanding by helping them learn something about themselves through an assessment. This could include things like personality we might measure, perhaps psychological skills, interpersonal style. The figure on this slide is from a measure called the Ottawa Mental Skills Assessment Tool, or OMSAT. It's designed to give an individual athlete feedback on where are they strongest and weakest in their use of a variety of psychological skills to improve their athletic performance. This is what the results of that measure might look like and be shown to an athlete or inform a sports psychologist. We might use it to evaluate outcomes or progress. So we might be trying to, for example, help an athlete better manage anxiety. So we might want to measure anxiety in competition or training over several periods of time, both before and after we start doing the intervention to see if it seems to be helping. We might be interested in assessing mental health or risk factors. We'll touch on this later in the course, that there certainly are some mental health issues that are of particular concern among athletic populations, and there might be measures we'd want to use to screen for people who might be at risk for those kinds of problems. We're seeing more popular these days the use of neuropsychological testing in sports, particularly around concerns about concussions. Neuropsychological testing is a specific kind of psychological testing that really focuses on the basic functions of the brain. So memory, thinking, manipulation, these sorts of things. And neuropsychological testing is important, especially in more violent or contact sports where concussions are more common. We're seeing a lot of sports that require now what they call baseline testing, say before a season starts, to be able to compare after a head injury to see if an athlete has returned to normal and is safe to return to their sport. We might be interested in predicting some outcomes or predicting them so that we can prevent some outcomes. So some folks in sports psychology have worked on scales to predict impending burnout or loss of interest in the sport, or what we call staleness in training, people for whom recovery is not really resulting in better improvements in their psychological and physical state. We can predict that with some measures and then intervene with some different ways of doing recovery that might help the athlete perform better. The last one I have up here I have in italics because it's somewhat controversial, and that would be talent selection or pre-selection into sports. So using psychological assessments to select people for teams, for scholarships, for being chosen in the professional draft or something like that. I think this is a pretty questionable practice, and I actually don't recommend it. I haven't seen much convincing evidence myself that there are reliable and valid measures that are useful predictors of, for example, professional sports success. It's really common right now. You see in the media all the time, and they are using different personality and intelligence assessments at things like the NFL Combine and whatnot. And I think that there's some real question about whether or not those are even appropriate to do. We'll talk about some of the reasons why they're a challenge in a slide or two, but one of the biggest questions is whether or not people can sort of fake good or fake bad, basically tell you what you want to know on the measure, because clearly an assessment at some place like NFL Combine, they're going to want to give you the right answers, not necessarily the answers of how they truly feel or think about things, but they're going to be trying to think, what do you want to hear? In other measures of things like intelligence, it's real questionable how important that is, depending on the sport. It may be more important that people have a really rich understanding and knowledge and intelligence, if you will, for their specific sport, even though maybe they don't possess broad intelligence or G intelligence, as we talk about it sometimes. So I think the use of a psychological assessment in talent selection is a pretty questionable practice of, in my view, pretty marginal usefulness, at least right now. That's an area I hope of continuing research. Now, we certainly know that, as with everything else, technology is transforming the way we approach measurement. Many measures that we used to do simply with paper and a pencil now are done on a tablet or a smartphone or something, and we can produce immediate results with those because of technology. Certainly, smartphones and other devices are making it easier to conduct measurement, what we call in vivo, or in real life, in the real world. One example of that is a measurement we call ecological momentary assessment, which gives people a chance to assess the way people are thinking or feeling at a given moment in time, prompted by a device like a smartphone or a smartwatch or something like that. So these sorts of things really are giving us new opportunities to do assessment we've never done before, and we're going to see fast developing improvements in this area. We also know there's lots of sensor technologies that can allow us to track various things in vivo, like heart rate as a measure of arousal, for example. We can do today with a variety of smartwatches have that capability. We can track where people go, how much ground they cover, their heart rate during the performance, beginning, middle, and end. And we'll probably start seeing sensors that will test for other sorts of things, like different kinds of emotions or whatnot, as technology continues to evolve. So there's a number of challenges for psychological assessment in sports psychology. This slide summarizes a few of them. One of the main ones is it's pretty hard to predict unpredictable events like exceptional achievement. So if you're trying to predict something like who's going to be a Pro Bowl NFL player versus just a starter for an NFL team versus who's going to flame out of NFL, it's pretty hard to predict that because the outcome is a very small number, only a few people achieve that. And you're trying to differentiate among pretty heterogeneous groups, people who, as a group are all well prepared to succeed at this, and trying to pick out that needle in a haystack who's going to be exceptionally successful is really hard to do. Psychological assessments are better at picking out exceptions from average, but we're often in sport not interested in exceptions from average. We're interested in exceptions to performances that are already fairly exceptional, and that becomes really hard to predict. As I mentioned a few slides ago, motivational factors can really influence our assessments. Are people telling us how they truly think and feel, or are they telling us what we want to know? That's a big challenge. A related issue to that is confidentiality and privacy. Whose information is this? Who's going to see it? What are the implications? You may get different answers from an assessment if you know the only person who's going to see it is the sports psychologist, versus the results of this test are going to be in the media, and the coaches are going to have access, and professional scouts are going to have access. You may get quite different responses. And there's a lot of ethical issues around whether it's appropriate to use psychological assessments in a context where there won't be confidentiality or privacy. And lastly, a big question that's constantly there in sports psychology is that even if a measure is reliable and valid, does it really matter for sports performance? As I mentioned earlier, a simple intelligence test is commonly done at most pre-draft professional sports evaluations. And it's really questionable how much the kind of intelligence that those matter really matters for who's going to be successful in a given sport or even at a position in a given sport. It may be more important, for example, for the keeper on a soccer team than a midfielder, or for a defensive lineman versus a quarterback, or for a setter versus a striker in volleyball. You just don't really know how much these really matter, and I think that's an important question. Often the kinds of things we want to know about, there's easier ways to get at them. For example, your textbook mentions that there's a sports psychologist who tries to assess coachability using a 200-question test. Well, I actually think probably a better way to assess that is talk to people who've coached that individual and try to get them to give you straightforward, honest information with reliable examples. Often the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. If somebody's been coachable before, they'll probably stay coachable. If they haven't been in the past, they're probably not going to be coachable in the future, especially after you pay them a few $1,000,000. So in conclusion, I would say that psychological assessment is widely used in sports psychology, is often helpful, as it is in all aspects of applied psychology. There's lots of different methods that are used, and technology is allowing us to develop new methods all the time. And we always want to keep in mind reliability and validity. They matter. We always want to be mindful of avoiding potential misuse of inappropriate psychological assessments in the wrong context or the wrong measures.